Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's Friday lecture series in the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford University. A couple of, issues related to the webinar Zoom format. Attendees are in listen-only mode, and only speakers are able to share are going to be able to share their video. The lecture portion of this webinar is being recorded on our class YouTube web page. Those who Q&A should have joined into the webinar, and the Q&A session will not be live streamed. So when you registered, you should have been able to do that, follow that link. All webinar attendees are muted throughout the webinar, but you can send questions to the Q&A button, and I will be able to read the questions at the end of the presentation to our speaker. And lastly, because of the way the post-event recording of the YouTube page works, we have a closed captioning option available, but you have to enable it in your automated captioning now. So you can go in and click into view those captions if you wish to do so. For those of us who are here at Stanford, we're in the land and the territory of the original peoples. UC Berkeley actually sits on the territory of the Shushun peoples, the unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the gratitude to the land, to the water, and to the air that surrounds us, and pay our respects to the past, the present, and the future of the Ohlone and the Lenape peoples who can often do in these webinars. If you find ways to support Native American indigenous peoples, wherever you are, they're being hit very hard by the COVID pandemic. At the very least, try to be informed and know about what's going on. Thank you again for joining us for this Zoom webinar. Our guest speaker today is Mara Loveman from UC Berkeley. She will be talking about the end of official color blindness and the rise of anti-racism in Latin America. She is a professor of sociology and professor and chair of the demography department at UC Berkeley. Her research examines ethno-racial politics, nationalism, and the state in the Americas from a comparative and historical perspective. I have to say, I know of who combine in this beautiful way in her work demography, and politics. She is an author of a multiple award-winning book, National Colors, Racial Classification and the State in Latin America, which blew me away when I read it, which traces when, how, and why Latin American states collected ethno-racial population colonial periods to the present. Her research has appeared in all the major journals in her discipline, and her current research today analyzes more the transformation of this landscape of America and some of their implications, which I think is what she's going to be talking to us about today. So Mara, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Alberto, for the invitation to be here, and to Sarah, also for all your work to get things set up, and to all of you out there in your respective Zoom lands for taking time out of your day to log in and engage with me and others here about what I think is really a critical facet of contemporary racial politics in Latin America. So I'm just gonna share my screen and jump in here. All right, so the last 2 decades, we've witnessed the demise of official color blindness across most of Latin America. And this shift is most clearly evident in national censuses. A few decades ago, almost no Latin American countries included questions about race or ethnicity on national censuses. Today, the collection of such data is the dominant practice in the region. You can see this shift clearly in this table, which basically just lists Latin American countries on the left and census decades across the top. A white circle indicates that a country took a census that made indigenous peoples visible in some way in that decade. A black circle means the same for afro-descendants. You can see that there was a major shift between the 1980s and the 2010s. Whereas in the 1980s, indigenous peoples were visible in just under half of the censuses in Latin America, and afro-descendants in only 2. By the 2010 census round, almost every country's census made both statistically visible. So in my past work, I've analyzed this regional shift as one outcome of the broader politics of recognition in the region in the last few decades. And I've written that this shift represents a historically momentous move towards greater statistical visibility of indigenous and afro-descendant populations in Latin America. I'm not alone in reading the trend in this way. The other analysts and organizations have also discussed this shift in terms of the long overdue realization of the need to make indigenous and afro-descendant groups officially visible in statistics so that inequalities can be documented and addressed. For example, this perspective is embraced by international development agencies and banks, such as the UN Development Program, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and others. Here's a statement from the UNDP from a document in 2012 that in English says that given that invisibility is also and essentially discrimination, this document and regional project together seek to contribute to the increased visibility of the Afro-descendant population. The idea that statistical invisibility is a form of discrimination is consistent with the views of activists in many countries in the region as well. They've pressed for the inclusion of new questions on the census as part of a broader politics of visibilization of distinct ethnic or racial identities. So for example, this is a poster from a conference that I attended in 2016 in Lima that brought together government officials, academics, activists to discuss the inclusion of a new ethnic self-identification question in the 2017 Peruvian census. The goal of this effort is explicitly stated on the poster: become visible to claim rights. So there's plenty of similar examples of this sort from activist groups and initiatives throughout the region. The politics that has fueled the inclusion of new race and ethnicity questions on censuses in Latin America is explicitly championed as a politics of recognition or visibilization of ethno-racial identities and populations. In my talk today, I want to problematize this framing to some extent in order to draw attention to a different reading of these trends. I want to draw attention to the fact that the politics of recognition in Latin America is not merely a politics and set of practices that makes visible what is already there, what had always already been, but had gone unrecognized. It is also a productive politics that affects the social and political realities that it pretends to simply describe. And to be clear, the politics of recognition is about recognition. And though it is also a productive politics, it's a politics that constitutes, that affects and shapes the social and political realities that it describes. Now, this idea that recognition of difference is constitutive, not merely reflective of social realities, is of course something that many others have written about. And it's also an idea that's consistent with many theoretical perspectives on the cultural power of the state. It's also a claim that can be difficult to empirically demonstrate, which is an issue that we can return to later if there is interest. Now, some of you may know, I spent some years researching when and how and why states in Latin America either do or do not produce racial or ethnic population data. What I want to suggest today is that in the current moment, especially, we need to pay more systematic attention to the varied things that the production of ethnic and racial population data itself produces. And we need to pay attention not only to the intended products, but to the unintended ones as well. So in this talk, I'm going to point to 5 types of things that the collection of population data on race or ethnicity may be productive of: new data, new knowledge, new social policies, new subjectivities, and new politics. Given the limited time we have today, I'm just going to touch on each of these briefly and offer a few quick examples. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about the implications of these arguments for our understanding of contemporary racial politics in Latin America. Before I dive into this, I just want to pause for a second and flag for you 2 overarching goals of my talk. Main goals of this talk. All right, so the first goal of this talk is simply to encourage social scientists and really any others who produce and analyze ethnic and racial population data to pay more attention to the productive effects of ethnic and racial statistics. We need to remember that statistics do not merely describe the world. They may play a role in constituting it, and not always in ways that we intend or anticipate. I want to encourage sociologists and social scientists especially to adjust our analytic lenses to more routinely, systematically, and rigorously encapsulate this possibility. And building off of this first goal, the second and perhaps more controversial goal of this talk is to advance the argument that the production and use of ethnic and racial population data in Latin America is producing both intended and unintended consequences, and that among the latter, the embrace of ethnic and racial data collection has contributed to producing a strand of reactionary racial politics, what we might call an anti-racist politics. And that in countries like Brazil, for example, this anti-racist politics has helped to fuel the broader rise of the reactionary right. Recent government efforts to collect racial and ethnic statistics and use them in public policy are producing both diffuse shifts in the salience of particular ethno-racial identities and concerted lines of political opposition, and that these together are being articulated by the right into one of the ideological pillars of reinvigorated populist mestizo nationalisms in the region. I'm going to come back to this argument, but for now I'm going to turn to my substantive claim that official ethnic and racial statistics are productive and provide some examples of the types of things that they are productive of. So first of all, and most straightforwardly, the collection of ethnic and racial population data in the census produces new data. In Latin America, we have seen a tremendous change in the datascape for research on racial and ethnic identities and inequalities in the region. It's really important to underscore that the existence of these data is historically momentous for many of these countries. For several of them, the most recent censuses are the first time in decades or ever that states have included questions about ethnic or racial identification on national censuses. With these data, we can now produce descriptive tables and maps that make indigenous and afro-descendant populations visible in comparative terms across Latin America. I'll get this right eventually. There we go. So here's an example of that was an example of an exercise that was commissioned by the World Bank. And here's another example, which are maps that show the distribution of indigenous and afro-descendant populations across Latin America. Here's another example showing their distribution relative to national populations. And here's just another showing the ethno-racial composition of each country according to recent census data in comparative terms. Now, these are just to give you a sense of the types of very basic descriptive visualization of demographic data that we can now produce that would have just had a lot more missing data and been impossible to produce and visualize in comparative terms just a decade or so ago. Second, the existence of these data has enabled a new wave of research that contributes new knowledge on ethno-racial inequalities in major life outcomes. So indeed, we're now actually in the midst of a proliferation of studies, an avalanche of statistics on ethno-racial populations and inequalities using these new census data. Exemplary of this are the numerous publications and reports coming out of the UN, the Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the World Bank, national statistics offices, and other research groups and organizations. I'm going to show you just a few quick examples of the types of graphs and analyses that you can find within these reports. I'm not going to discuss the results today. I just want to illustrate the kinds of information and analyses that are being made possible by the existence of these data in the region. And for those of you who may research racial inequalities using nationally representative data in the US, these kinds of reports and data, may seem just routine and mundane, but it's important to imagine that If this were the first time we were able to produce statistics on racial and ethnic disparities in the US was in the 2000s or 2010s. So for some of these countries, these kinds of pictures and tables and graphs are being produced for the first time ever in their histories. So here's just an example of some simple bar graphs that show rural and urban disparities in access to electricity, water, and sewage, broken down by whether populations are indigenous or not, and compared across several countries. Here's an example showing disparities in higher education attendance of afro-descendants versus non-afro-descendant, broken down by sex for 10 different countries in the region. Now, again, the key point here is that we can now produce and visualize comparative statistics by group and across countries in ways that we just couldn't before. Okay, so the politics of recognition targeted at censuses produced new data and new knowledge about ethno-racial inequalities in Latin America. The transformed datascape, in turn, has been productive of new policies. In a growing number of countries, ethno-racial data from censuses is providing a basis for claims for targeted social policies to address the inequalities that we can now document. No country has gone further in this direction than Brazil. And so at this point, I'm going to focus in for a few moments on the Brazilian context. Now, really, I want to focus in on Brazil here for two reasons. First, because Brazil had become an explicit model for race-targeted social policy that other countries in the region cited and sought to emulate. And the most well-known of these policies, of course, are the quota policies for admission to universities and federal government hiring. And then second, because the recent political earthquake in Brazil raises the question of whether or not the country that had been held up as the regional model for national social policy to address racial inequalities may be a harbinger of the type of reactionary opposition to these programs we might see in places where such efforts are just now getting a foothold. The embrace of government collection of racial statistics came earlier to Brazil than the rest of the region. Indeed, Brazil was one of few states in Latin America that had a long history of such data collection on and off since its first census back in 1872. In the 1970 census, though, when Brazil was under a military regime, the decision was made to omit the question about race or color from the national census. The military government decided that the question was irrelevant in a so-called racial democracy, which is what they claimed Brazil was. So in the 1980s, as part of this a much broader movement for democratization, Brazilian Black movement activists and allied scholars fought for the inclusion of the race and color question on the 1980 census. They succeeded in getting the question put back on the census. And by the late 1980s and 1990s, scholars were producing papers and books showing racial disparities in Brazil in income, education, employment, and so on. These studies then bolstered arguments for public policies to address racial inequality in Brazil. Together with sustained political mobilization, strategic political pressure, and critical international alliances, research on racial inequalities helped to persuade the Cardoso government and then the PT government to introduce affirmative action policies to reduce inequality in government employment and higher education. Brazil's experience suggested then a more or less linear path from sustained mobilization to advocate the addition of questions to the census, to alliance with social scientists to produce new knowledge about racial inequality, to the development of policies to address it, and then to passing through a whole bunch of complicated and non-linear political wrangling to getting policies legislated and implemented. Fast forward a bit, and in the 2000s, affirmative action was introduced into Brazilian federal universities and government employment. There were a wide range of program designs and experiments in different federal and state universities, and I'm not going to delve into the nuts and bolts of these policies today. The gist of what eventually emerged as national policy in the field of higher education is nicely captured in this graphic. So if you start on the left with the dark blue box and then stepping upward to the right, The policy was to reserve 50% of slots for those from public schools, which in the Brazilian context was used as a rough proxy for social class. And then 50% of those slots were reserved for low income and the rest for any income. And then 50% of those slots were reserved for Blacks, Browns, indigenous, and persons with disabilities. I'm now up in the upper yellow corner. Proportional to their size in the state, according to the state level population data. Now, again, this slide is just one sort of schematic illustration of how some of these policies worked and the federal policy worked. The key here is that simply that the production of, for present purposes anyway, the key here is that the production of racial statistics contributed to the successful political mobilization and justification for affirmative action policies to get implemented, and then also to the way that these policies were implemented because of how census data were used to determine the quota setting within each state. Okay. Let's get that today. So these policies in turn were productive of new patterns of racial identification and possibly to new subjective self-understandings of race among ordinary Brazilians. I want to be clear that I don't think that this process is totally top-down or automatic or inevitable. The productive effects of official ethno-racial data production and use on subjectivities is much more contingent and politically interactive and unpredictable than we tend to appreciate. That said, I also suspect that it's rare that there are zero productive effects of such policies. This is another reason why it's incumbent on us to attend to these processes more routinely in our analyses of these types of data and their consequences. So in the Brazilian context, there's evidence from both qualitative and quantitative studies to suggest that the implementation of racial quota policies altered Brazilians' racial self-identifications, but not simply in the direct and instrumental way that many critics of the policies predicted. Okay, so I'm saying that these policies affected how ordinary Brazilians saw themselves and how they saw others in racial terms. That's actually a pretty strong substantive claim. So you might be asking, how do we know this? And here I'm just going to show you some findings that appeared in an article that I co-authored with colleagues Stanley Bailey and Fabrício Fialho that appeared last year in Sociological Science. We looked at how Brazilians' self-reported racial identification changed between 1995 and 2008. We have survey data from basically 1995, which is before the widespread implementation of racial quotas in higher education, and then again several years afterwards, although 2008 was not yet its peak. We basically just compared responses in these two nationally representative surveys that both included an open-ended question for racial identification, where people could choose any term they wanted to, and a closed format question where they had to choose an ID term from among government census categories, which are essentially the same categories that were used to implement the quota policies in the universities. So you can read more about the details online if you're interested. I just want to highlight a few key findings for present purposes. So this graph compares responses to the open-ended survey question about racial identification in 1995, which is shown in dark blue, versus 2008, which is shown in light blue. There's two things that I want to point your attention to in this table for now. The first is that Moreno was the second most popular category throughout this period, even though it has never been a category option on a Brazilian census. I'm pointing to this just to remind us that people's self-understandings do not generally originate with the state, nor are they monopolized by state categories. Second, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the Pardo category, which is brown in Brazil, became a lot more popular in this period, corresponding to its use not only in the census, but also in public policy. Now, this graph compares responses between the two surveys in the closed format survey question. Again, you see that a lot more Brazilians chose the Pardo category in 2008 than in 1995. Now, in the paper, we also looked at the change in the likelihood that an individual's response in the open-ended question and the closed format question would match between 1995 and 2008. And we found that responses to the two queries were much more likely to match in 2008, as more individuals actually spontaneously chose an official category in response to the open format question in 2008 than they had in 1995. Okay, so we venture from our analyses of these surveys that they provide at least strong suggestive evidence that the institutionalization of race-targeted affirmative action shifted patterns of subjective self-identification in Brazil. Of course, this wasn't the only thing going on in Brazil at this time, but it's at least strong suggestive evidence that it played some role. We also note in the article that in a key respect, these shifting identification patterns did not align with the aims or the politics of most of those who lobbied for affirmative action policies in the first place. Many Black movement activists and anti-racist social scientists argued for the irrelevance or the downplaying of the boundary between Blacks and Browns in Brazil in favor of a white versus non-white analytic and political lens. But instead of softening distinctions between pretos and pardos, Blacks and Browns, and building a broad non-white identification as negro or Black, the way that affirmative action was implemented and regulated in Brazil likely had the unintended consequence of sharpening the boundary between pardos and pretos, even as it led many Brazilians to identify as pardo instead of white. Okay, so this leads me finally to the claim that ethno-racial data production and its linkage to social policy may be productive of new politics. In the period of political mobilization that led up to the passage of the racial quota laws, policies in Brazil, there were efforts to downplay distinctions within the non-white population. And these were important for the purpose of building the broadest possible constituency to press for race data and race-targeted social policies to combat racial inequality and racism in Brazilian society. We then moved to a different political moment in Brazil, and the focus of ethno-racial political contestation shifted mostly from the field of mobilization to struggles over the distribution of scarce resources through quota systems. In this context, we saw the boundaries of Blackness being questioned and policed, and often drawn in ways that excluded many self-identified brown Brazilians. A consequence of this, in turn, appears to be the heightening or the brightening of the boundary between brown and Black Brazilians, rather than the blurring of the boundary to unify non-whites in relation to whites. So this is a poster from the website of a Brazilian Black student group that asks, who are the Black quota students at our university? The poster points out that 51% of the Brazilian population is Black, and that the other half has double the opportunities. I just want to note that in order to arrive at that number of 51%, they have to include census self-identified Blacks and Browns, because self-identified Blacks alone on the Brazilian census account for barely more than 10% of the population. Nonetheless, the picture is clearly one that represents Brazil in terms of a clear dichotomous Black-white divide. At the bottom, the poster notes that false self-identification is a crime. This is in reference to the fact that some students stood accused of falsely identifying themselves as Black to take advantage of the quota system. Now, this poster was part of a broader anti-racial fraud campaign in Brazil. Most media coverage of this politics focused on people who purportedly falsely claimed to be non-white when they were actually or socially white. However, a much more politically ominous facet of this anti-racial fraud campaign was that charges were also levied against pardos, Browns, who were seen as not being Black enough. This is an article that appeared in English in Foreign Policy in 2017, so some of you may have seen it. It tells the story of a woman who stood accused of racial fraud for identifying herself as parda, which again is brown, in the application process for a public prosecutor job. And this is the woman herself. Now, those who criticize individuals like this for using the quotas that were originally set up, pardos and pretos, now argued that these were meant for, quote, people with Black grandmothers. They were meant for those with very dark skin. So criteria that differentiated among non-whites in Brazil that were erased or downplayed in a mobilizational moment of politics are being resurrected and redrawn in a moment of political fighting over scarce resources. Again, an unintended consequence of these policies and reactions to them has been to sharpen the boundary between self-identified Black and brown Brazilians rather than to soften it. Now, the sorts of controversies that came out of the implementation of racial quota policies were not restricted to the field of politics delimited by universities or public employment. As in the United States, these debates spilled over into party politics and into broader popular culture and debates. In the most recent presidential election, the attack on racial quota policies was one of the major talking points and pillars of the Bolsonaro campaign. The anti-racism of his campaign was explicit. Here he is wearing a t-shirt that says, "My color is Brazil." This is very clearly a way of saying that identification by color or race is un-Brazilian. Now, a big part of this message in the campaign was communicated via social media memes, which played a really important role in the election, as you may have read or you may know about firsthand. I'm going to show you just a few examples of these. There's some of the tamer versions of sort of racist, anti-racist memes from these slides. I'm not going to explain them. I'm just going to give you a moment to look at them, but I'm also just warning you that they're coming. Here they are. Actually, I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so you get just a sense of some of that. So these are just examples of the anti-racist politics and one form that they took on social media during the campaign. But this politics was not restricted to terrible racist humor on social media. It was also part of an explicit political platform. And this is, some of you may know, this is Fernando Holliday, who was elected to Sao Paulo's city council in 2016. He was the first openly gay politician on the council, and this was his platform: to combat victimism, to end racial quotas in public service exams, and to revoke Black Consciousness Day. All of these were deemed un-Brazilian. So the rise of anti-racism in Brazil is not only an online phenomenon or a platform for reactionary electoral politics, it's also fuel for explicitly race and gender targeted political violence. The new anti-racialist and anti-racist politics in Brazil has a side that is vicious, brutal, and violent. It has a side that is lethal. And yet, when we look at the election results and try to understand where support for Bolsonaro came from, much like folks did here in their soul searching after the Trump's electoral victory, we see that there is much less racial polarization on opinions about him that we in the US at least might expect. So this slide shows support for Bolsonaro by different kinds of demographic groups. Starting from the top, you have evangelicals, upper, middle, and high income, people in the center and southwest of the south and center west of the country, Jews, men, those ages 60 plus, et cetera, et cetera. You can see that pretty much the vast majority of demographic breakdowns that we looked at supported Bolsonaro by substantial margins. This slide shows candidate preference for Bolsonaro versus his opponent by race or racial self-identification. And you can see that he won a lot, by a lot, among both self-identified browns and whites, and he lost by some among self-identified Blacks, but the split was not nearly as big as we might have expected. And you can see this even more clearly here. And there are two things I want to point out here for now. And one is that it seems that Bolsonaro's anti-racist platform either appealed to or at least did not alienate the majority of Brazilians, regardless of racial identification. And second, I want you to notice that whites and pardos are more alike in their support of Bolsonaro than Blacks, even as the support from self-identified Blacks is higher than we might expect. Okay, so where does this leave us? I've just presented you with a series of examples, hold on there for a second, a series of examples of things that ethnic and racial data production and the politics of recognition more generally have been productive of. New data, new knowledge, new policies, new subjectivities, and new politics. I want to close by returning to the two overarching goals of my talk and elaborating just a bit more on each of them. So first, I want to underscore that the politics of recognition and visibility are not only about recognizing what is already there. The addition of new questions and categories on censuses to collect and produce ethnic and racial population data has productive effects. As social scientists who work with these data, we need to adopt an analytic lens or perspective that guides us to focus routinely on the productive facets of data that appear to merely describe social identities and experiences. We need to attend more systematically to both the intended products of these data, things like more descriptive statistics and maps that show the racial composition of populations and their characteristics, things like carefully designed statistical analyses that discover and explain the sources of racial disparities in all sorts of consequential life experiences and outcomes. And we also need to attend more systematically to the possible unintended productive effects of these data and their uses. Things like diffuse and unpredicted changes in identification patterns or subjectivities, such as the increased resonance and salience of the intermediate Pardo category in Brazil, which ended up looking closer to whites than to Blacks in relation to support for the new reactionary right-wing president. Things like new strands of anti-racist politics that become possible and resonate with broad segments of the population as arguments and data are used in ways that articulate with historical national ideologies of non-racialism or racial democracy. Now, on this first objective of my talk, I want to clarify and emphasize that I am not making a facile argument against the production or analysis of racial or ethnic statistics. For those concerned with ethno-racial inequality and injustice, and with dignity and rights, there are many productive facets of ethno-racial data production. Rather, I'm arguing that we need to also notice and attend to and analyze the fact that there are also many unproductive and counterproductive productive facets of collecting, analyzing, and administering social policies with official ethnic and racial categories. We, and by we here, I'm talking about sociologists and other social scientists at the moment, we tend to focus a lot on the productive parts of the story and to neglect or wish away the other parts. Now, thinking about racial data collection only through the lens of statistical visibility and recognition and efforts to document and ameliorate inequalities can deflect our attention away from the other parts of the story. And we have to pay attention to these other parts of the story too, or we will fail to understand and explain, much less to predict, how and when the politics of recognition can also be productive of cultural changes in individual and collective understandings of racial identity, as well as more targeted political dynamics that are in tension with, if not directly opposed to, the anti-racist aims that prompt collection of racial data in the first place. Now, in the Brazilian case, and here I'm returning to the second overarching aim of my talk, in the Brazilian case, the politics of racial data production has been productive of policies that help to fuel the politics of anti-racist reaction with much broader cross-racial resonance than most of us would have expected. The Brazilian experience suggests that if we want to understand and explain the popular resonance of resurgent, reactionary, right-wing politics in Latin America, we need to attend more systematically to the ways that the politics of recognition that has demanded and achieved the end of official colorblindness in Latin America, along with the greater recognition of racial discrimination and racial inequality in those societies. We have to attend to how this politics of ethno-racial recognition is productive of other outcomes as well. And not all of them are in line with the anti-racist aims and agendas of those who advance the politics of recognition in the first place. I'll end by just noting that ethnic and racial data collection is political through and through. It is both produced by politics and productive of politics, and there is no way around this. In the current moment in Brazil, we have seen that it is productive of a form of anti-racist politics that reverberates broadly. I believe that those reverberations contributed to the electoral outcome in Brazil. And I'll not be surprised when similar reverberations emerge in other parts of the region, where anti-racist politics and policies are still much more tenuous and politically fragile in the months and years ahead. Thank you. I'm going to stop there. So I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Mara. Thank you everyone for listening in. We now turn to the Q&A section of our discussion with her.